Hello, Amy. Welcome to the Soul Line Self Care Podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Tina. I'm super happy to be here too.
Tell me a little bit about yourself so that the listeners know everything there is to know before we start chatting.
I had the fortune of discovering nutrition when I was about 12 years old. I decided to become a vegetarian after reading a book
Cool.
called 101 Ways to Save the Animals.
Aw.
And it was written by the founder of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And you can imagine as a 12-year-old being thrown into all of this knowledge about animal husbandry in the agricultural industry and animal testing for cosmetics and the fur industry. And
Mhm.
I was just aghast. I was completely mortified. And so I threw out all my leather, my fur, all my animal tested products, and then came to a point where I realized like I couldn't be in integrity with these values if I continued to eat meat.
Mhm.
And at that point, I was about 13. And so I decided to go vegetarian. And this was in the early 90s. So it was actually right at, kind of in the middle of a second wave of vegetarianism that had cropped up about 20 years after the vegetarian environmentalism movement of the 60s and 70s.
Mhm.
So I did a lot of reading about vegetarianism and the nutritional adequacy of a vegetarian diet because I had some family members that were concerned, rightfully so,
Yeah.
about my iron intake, and protein deficiency. And my logic at the time was like, being 12, I was like, well, the entire nation of India is vegetarian. So it
Yeah,
has to
that's
be
true.
okay.
Yeah.
And so I started with that premise and then went out to prove my point.
That's
And in that, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's very interesting that it was such a young age. I feel like when you're exposed to the knowledge that you were exposed to at such a young age, it has just like this, I think it has a bigger effect than when you're an adult, you
I
know?
agree. I agree. Yeah, I think there's that particular stage of development, I think is so profound in terms of, you're really starting to begin to develop a sense of autonomy and a sense of right and wrong and justice. And then, yeah, being exposed to something like that and the environmental movement as well. I became I was one of the annoying vegetarians.
Oh, I used to call it, well, I'm comparing it to people who are vegan, but I used to call them angry vegans. I was vegan myself for a while. I'm vegetarian also, and I used to call them the angry vegans. I'm like, don't be so angry. You're scaring everybody. Just like,
Yeah, I did learn quickly that my anger and rage was not an effective conversion factor. It did
no,
not.
scary. Yeah, it can be
Yeah.
scary.
So that was my foray into nutrition. And really what it did is it opened up my eyes to how much what we eat can impact our health. And that the heart disease that's very prevalent in my family didn't have to be.
Hmm.
People didn't have to get heart disease, they didn't have to get cancer. And at that point in time, diabetes was not was not as prevalent as it is now. So it was more heart disease and cancer that were top of mind for me then.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and
So let me stop you there because I don't want to pass over that point. I feel like it's so important because a lot of people have they have it seared almost into their brain that it's their destiny if both their parents had diabetes, both their parents had cancer, or heart disease, whatever, just name your disease. They feel like their chances of getting that are it almost seems like they think it's almost like 100% when it's
right,
such a small percentage. And I've seen different people say different things like it's 5%, it's 7%, it's 10%, but like hereditary, like it's a small percentage that puts you into that category. You have so much control over it. So I just want to point that out.
absolutely. Yeah. You may have a genetic predisposition, and most of us have a genetic predisposition for something, but it is our environment that triggers the genetic decline.
Hmm.
So you can have a predisposition to diabetes, you can have a prevalence of heart disease in your family, But if you live your life differently, if you eat differently, you manage stress differently, you exercise, right, you can make significant strides in avoiding the same outcomes that your parents and grandparents did.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important to know that.
It is, it is. And I do feel like I feel incredibly blessed to have discovered that at such a young age.
Hmm.
And as I started studying nutrition, I just became more and more enamored with it. And I've never climbed out.
Hmm.
So I
That's
stayed
cool.
yeah, yeah. I stayed a vegetarian for 13 years. I'm no longer a vegetarian. Which is a whole other a whole other conversation we may or may not get into.
Yeah.
And I ended up, by time I was about 15, I decided I wanted to become a nutritionist and help people prevent disease, help prevent the suffering that happens with chronic disease. So I obtained both a bachelor's degree in nutrition as well as a master's degree, and also got a minor in exercise science and physiology. So I'm a certified personal trainer as well as a licensed nutritionist.
Very cool. Very cool. So I have to ask you about that because I think it's very important. Because another thing that happens inside of the vegan, sometimes vegetarian community is some kind of a judgment when somebody decides not to be vegetarian or vegan anymore. And there's usually some pretty damn good reasons
Mhm.
because everybody's body is differently, everybody needs different things. So maybe you could share with us
Yeah,
what made you.
absolutely. So I ended up starting an animal rights organization in junior high school, and did some writing for national vegan magazines. I made several attempts to go vegan over those 13 years. And my body would always, after about 3 months, I would have such strong cravings for eggs and dairy that I could never
Mhm.
stay on it completely. So
Yep.
it always felt like a moral failing on my part.
Yeah.
Because my ideology was so strong, it was as powerful as a religion for me.
Hmm.
There was a point in time in adolescence where I would have, I felt like to die myself would be a more aligned value than to resort to eating meat again.
Hmm.
So it was definitely like I had family members, after 13 years who couldn't like grasp that I was eating meat again. Like it just they couldn't they couldn't
Yeah.
understand how this could happen. But what ended up happening for me is I'd gone to Bastyr University, which is a private naturopathic college in Washington State that
Hmm.
has a vegetarian campus. And I in throughout the process of my nutrition education, I learned some things about like the importance of omega-3 fatty acids, and that omega-3 fatty acids are much, much better absorbed in cold water fish and animal foods than in our plant foods. The
Hmm.
human body does not have um, a strong ability to convert the plant omega-3 fats into DHA and EPA, which are those anti-inflammatory compounds that really soothe inflammation in the body and help
Hmm.
help us have that appropriate balance between an inflammatory response and an anti-inflammatory response. And then I also learned about the importance of vitamin D, and that vitamin D is extremely hard to get from foods. And the foods that contain vitamin D, aside from mushrooms grown in sunlight, are animal foods.
Hmm.
So I had grown up in Alaska, where natural sources of vitamin D from sun were very infrequent, quite rare. And throughout my adolescence, until I actually left the state for college, I had significant seasonal affective disorder. So when I got to college and I was learning about these things, I was like, wow, well, maybe trying to be vegan in Alaska and low fat vegan because it was the 90s,
Hmm.
perhaps
That's
that,
awful.
I know, right? Perhaps that's why I had such severe seasonal affective disorder.
Yeah.
Um, and so I kind of, took that information, tucked it in the back of my head, considered taking an omega-3 fatty acid supplement, but, just kind of entertained the idea and didn't follow through with it. And then about a year after I had finished my bachelor's degree, I was taking a health coach certification program. And in one of the lectures, the teacher was talking about oppression and how all of us, in one way or another, have been oppressed in our lives. And it doesn't always look the same. And just kind of highlighting oppression and having a sensitive lens to be able to work with people with a history of oppression. And I, you know, didn't think anything of it. And then afterwards, I went to a cooking class. And this woman was talking about how she had been a macrobiotic vegan. And one day she was walking along Manhattan down the street, and she, as she said, her body literally stopped her in front of a burger joint, and she couldn't move until she went in and got a burger. And it like changed her life.
That's
She
so
had
funny.
transformative experience. Um, and something about those two lectures in the same day caused these synapses in my brain to connect. And
Mm-hmm.
I realized that my adherence at that point, my adherence to a vegetarian diet was a form of oppression on my animal body.
Mm-hmm.
At that point in time, I had been having meat had started smelling good again, which was very peculiar because it was repulsive to me for a long time. And then it started
Same.
looking good, which really
Mm-hmm.
freaked me out. It actually looked good and I didn't, but I kept kind of pushing that away, pushing that away, pushing that away. But that day in that moment, I realized your body is telling you something and you're refusing to listen. And that's
Mm-hmm.
nothing you would ever do if a client came to you with that same information.
Yeah.
So I went home. And at this point in time, I sat on the board for the Earth Save chapter of Seattle, which is a vegetarian advocacy and environmental group. And I went to Whole Foods and I walked up to the deli counter and I asked for a sample of beef. And then I took that sample of beef and I walked away, found an aisle where nobody was standing because I couldn't be seen doing this. And I ate the beef. And it was like,
Yeah.
maybe it'll taste like blood. It'll be horrific. And I won't, we can stop here. And it didn't. It tasted good. And I was like, okay, well, all right, here we go. So I went back and I ordered a 3-ounce portion to take home and I turned it into a taco. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm going to eat this beef and maybe I'll have horrific stomach cramps. I won't be able to digest it anymore. I can say I tried. We can go back to doing things as status quo. And that was the thing I kept telling myself is like, you can always go back to being a vegetarian. You know how to do this, but you have to give your body an opportunity. Like we have to see if this is actually something that you need right now.
Yeah.
And I digested it well. And I was like, okay, let's continue to try this out. And what I discovered was that for me, it was beef first. Pork was repellent. Both pork and chicken tasted very dirty to me. I didn't like them. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't ever learn how to cook fish, even though I grew up in Alaska. So, so I kind of like left fish alone for a little bit. And in introducing meat, beef specifically, I found I was able to focus for longer periods of time. I would just became very grounded and very focused. And for years afterwards, before I did any kind of lecture, any kind of public speaking, anything where I was really putting myself out there, I would have a large portion of beef to really center and ground myself so that I could be on the straight
Yeah.
and not get lost and scattered.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, when I had reintroduced meat, I was in my mid-20s. I was also running marathons
Mm-hmm.
and I had IBS. So I was not absorbing nutrients, and this is probably why my body was very much like, can we please have some meat now? Between the activity I was doing and the IBS, I'm sure I was extremely nutrient depleted.
Yeah.
So I responded really well to the protein, and then over time, I was able to introduce other animal foods and learn how to cook fish. But it was not until about a year after I had introduced meat that I discovered I also had, the reason I had IBS was because I had developed an intolerance to gluten, dairy, and soy.
Yeah. Which
And
is hard when you're vegetarian, vegan.
exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. And thank goodness I made that choice to reintroduce meat before I found that out. Because if I
Hmm.
had had that strong adherence to the ideology,
Hmm.
it would have been incredibly devastating emotionally.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know that I could have done it. And then had I done a gluten-free, dairy-free, soy-free, low-fat, vegetarian diet as a
Corn.
marathoner.
Corn. Yeah. It's like that's like everything. Like yeah. I have to share with you too. Um, so I was vegan for a number of years and I always craved eggs. Always.
Mm,
I never craved cheese. I never craved meat. Like you said, meat doesn't smell good to me. It still doesn't smell good to me, but eggs I craved. So I just started eating eggs. I always ate honey. I never really understood the whole honey thing. But I think what's important here is that it doesn't have to be all or nothing, you know? And I think there's a huge part of when you become vegetarian or vegan where the judgment of others,
yeah,
the people in your communities, because those are tight communities, right? The judgment of others really stop you in your tracks. And I always say, what should I call myself? I don't even know what to call myself. Like I don't eat a lot of dairy, but if someone makes a cake or offers me a cookie, I'm not going to be
mm,
like, is there a dairy in there? I'm like, no, give me the cookie. Give me um, so it's like I say it's like I'm on the Tina diet because I eat
nice.
whatever the heck I want. Like I'm going to eat whatever I want. I'm going to do what's best for my body, what makes me feel good. So I think tuning into your body and really paying attention to how you feel, what you crave. And just because you crave sugar doesn't mean you need sugar. I just want to clarify that.
An important
But
point.
yeah. But I think I think it like just noticing that your brain fog went away and then the IBS thing, that's really important. And I myself I'm kind of going through something very similar because I'm having trouble with my histamine levels and just
Mm,
having like a lot of reactivity to a lot of things.
yeah,
And so like going on a low histamine diet, which could be, it's almost impossible. I feel like
it
it's
is.
almost impossible. And all the things that I eat are like high histamine, like soy and avocados. And I'm like, "Ah, forget this. And I'm like, there's nothing left. Beet legumes, certain legumes. It's like, what am I supposed to eat? Then I feel like all the stuff that's left to eat isn't really a complete diet, you know?
Yeah.
And so uh learning something like that about yourself is can be devastating when you're thinking like, well, how am I going to balance this out? What am I going to do to fix this? And I'm still like in the middle of trying to figure that out.
I
um
think one of the challenges in nutrition is that we still approach everything from a restrictive standpoint.
mhm.
We approach we approach the restoration of health through restriction, and I am no longer convinced that is the path.
That's a good point. Yeah,
I,
yes.
in working with people who do have gut issues, sometimes by the time they get to me, they're like, well, I was low FODMAP, but then I developed oxalate issues or histamine issues. So now I'm on a low oxalate, low histamine, low FODMAP diet, and there's
Crazy.
nothing I can eat.
They could just eat
And I'm
meat.
and I'm boxed into a corner. How do
Yeah,
I get out?
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And the more we restrict foods, the less nutrients we can offer our body and to heal.
Hmm.
And you get to a point where you don't have the fundamental nuts and bolts required to patch your system back together.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Also, when you're cutting out all these different foods and you're doing all these different things, really what you need to do is, of what I decided was I don't really need the low histamine diet. What I need to do is figure out why I'm so sensitive in the first place.
that's
And
exactly it.
and by cutting everything out, you're actually losing all your guiding, the things that are going to guide you to figure out.
Mm.
Now, if I was extremely reactive and it was life threatening, be a whole different story, but it's not, so it's kind of like, all right, well, I need to figure out, like, is it my gut? Is my gut imbalanced too? You know what I mean? So like you have to look at the what's causing it in the first place, because finding a solution to control my histamines on a low histamine diet, or oxalates, and like, so
Mhm.
basically I'm not eating anything, I'm just eating meat, and then where am I getting well, that just doesn't sound like any fun whatsoever. Like, I just love food, and I
Yeah,
eat very healthy. I eat very healthy. So I eat a lot of vegetables, a lot of beans, I eat a lot of nuts, I do eat soy. Like, so I'm just like, I'm just gonna eat, and I'm just gonna try to figure out, and it's such a slow process, as you
yeah,
probably know.
yeah.
But I want to like I want to talk about uh women that are moving into like perimenopause and menopause, because when we go into these different age groups, uh, we don't absorb things as well, right? Like, as like proteins, like vitamin D, like
Yeah,
we're not as efficient, and so things that might have been like low level problems turning to bigger problems, and all of a sudden nothing's okay in our system. So maybe you
exactly.
could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So as all humans age, our systems become less efficient. And so this will, eventually happen with men as well, but for them, it doesn't generally become an issue until they're in their 50s or their 60s. And that's when they really struggle to keep their muscle mass and begin a more rapid decline. For women, when we enter perimenopause, that's when things start to change for us. Estrogen is very protective. And with the disruption of consistently cycling estrogen, as estrogen levels begin to drop, our ability to hold on to our muscle mass begins to decline. And if we are not lifting heavy things, and I'm not talking about 3 pound pink dumbbells, I mean, a gallon of milk weighs more than that. You can
Mm,
do more. And in order to keep your muscle mass, you need to do more. We need to be lifting heavy things to stimulate our body, to tell our body, this muscle's important, keep it. Your
mhm,
body will prioritize that which is getting used. And the other thing that happens is with that loss of estrogen is that we are not able to build muscle as effectively once we lose it. And so we need more protein at each meal in order to stimulate what's called muscle protein synthesis, or the building of protein, the building
mhm,
of muscle mass. And this is believed to be due to an amino acid called leucine.
mhm,
Leucine is an amino acid that basically acts as a messenger, and it tells the body, muscle's important. Let's build muscle. Let's keep muscle. And if we don't receive sufficient leucine in a meal, the message isn't strong enough for the body to hear it. It's as though somebody's whispering at you from across a room. You're not going to get
mhm.
the message, right?
Yeah,
You want to be shouting.
yeah.
And in order to stimulate a significant enough leucine dose to stimulate muscle growth, we need about 30 to 40 grams of protein at each meal.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
a,
it's quite a lot for many women, particularly women who have been conditioned to eat like birds their entire life. It
mhm.
may be more than double what they're currently taking in.
Yeah, yeah. I I think a good point to make too right now is, what has protein in it, because it is not just meat, and it's not just eggs, and
Right.
so maybe you could talk a little bit about how there's 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 protein in literally everything, but
There is
different types.
different types and different amounts.
Hmm.
So, for instance, some of the things that I'll see out there is like, well, broccoli is 45% protein.
Hmm.
And what that means, and don't quote me on that because I don't know if it's exactly 45%, or,
Hmm.
it's about, 3 grams of protein per serving. And I'm seeing this actually here in Europe as well. When they're advertising protein as a feature of a food, they're doing it by percent. This is
Okay.
X% protein. But if something has 100 calories and it's 20% protein, it sounds like it's got a lot of protein. Oh, it's 20% protein,
Mm-hmm.
but that's only 20 calories from protein, which is actually 5 grams.
Okay.
And so if you need 30 at a meal, getting your protein from broccoli, even though it's 45%
It's
protein,
not enough.
pounds
Yeah.
of broccoli. And then
Yeah.
you will have some gut issues trying to digest all of that fiber, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to protein, particularly as we're aging, we want to look for the most protein with the fewest calories, um, the highest concentration of protein, right? To get to those 30 grams. Yes, animal proteins are the most robust
Mm-hmm.
sources of protein, the most concentrated, and they also contain all of the amino acids
Mm-hmm.
that we need in order to create muscle mass. However, aside from meat, dairy and eggs are also high quality proteins. Tofu is probably the best. Soybeans are the best source of plant-based protein in terms of
Mm-hmm.
concentration. So if you tolerate soy, tofu, tempeh, edamame, those are
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. Those are
Yeah.
fantastic. Once you get into the other legumes, your appetite, having a hearty appetite becomes a bit more important because a cup of garbanzo beans or pinto beans has, anywhere from 12 to 15 grams of protein per cup.
Mm-hmm.
So then we're looking at, 2.5 cups of beans at a meal. And for some people, that's a real struggle, either
Well,
due to,
that, yeah, that's a lot of beans. It's also a lot of fiber,
yeah,
and so I think there's a lot of power in combining a lot of these things. And I think it's important to remember that when you eat a meal, if you're eating, whether it's tofu and some veggies or beans and veggies or meat and veggies, that it's not just the meat that has the protein in it. And there's other things. And if it's really important for you to like get 30 or 40 grams at each meal, you could use something to measure it, like a chronometer or something like that, which
yeah,
is a
I do
really,
recommend Chronometer to all of my clients.
yeah.
And that's a really, it's not something you need to do forever, but it can be very, very helpful for not only seeing where you are in
Hmm.
terms of how much protein you think you're getting versus how much you're actually getting, but
Exactly.
then as you're logging, you can see, you can find those meals that hit all the buttons,
Hmm.
right? And then you can save them as a meal, which I love.
Yeah.
So you've got this sort of preloaded meal that you know is going to get you there. And
Yeah.
it's a really powerful tool for teaching people how to customize, really, how to
Hmm.
customize their habitual meal plan to what they need, whether we're looking at protein or whether we're looking at a micronutrient like iron or magnesium or folate. It's
Hmm.
extremely helpful for that. Um, and everything counts. It's when you look at like, adding the hummus with the broccoli and, and maybe some additional beans or an egg or something on there, and you're like, oh, look, I'm so close. Like I'm
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that tool, and I'm currently using it right now just to test like my fiber intake and stuff like
Mhm.
that, to see how much fiber I'm getting, because I know how important that is, especially middle age, when you're getting that that belly
The little
fat. It's like, all
belly.
right,
Yeah.
like how much fiber? I usually do have a lot of fiber, but I'm just sometimes, like you said, you think you're doing something right, and you're like, oh, I'm not really hitting it. I'm not really hitting my fiber intake. I'm not hitting my protein. I know for a fact right now, I'm probably not hitting my protein. And
Yeah.
so it's really good to like you said, learn where you're at and just look at it and be like, okay, like one of the meals I eat a lot in the morning is oatmeal with like a lot of blueberries, because I love blueberries. Like that's a staple. Like if I don't have blueberries in the house, I have nothing to eat. Like, you know how you have those staples, like you're like, if I don't
Totally.
have this, then it's like I'm starving and I have no food in the house and I need to go food shop. Blueberries is one of those. And not necessarily oatmeal. It's not like my favorite. For some reason, oatmeal doesn't keep me full that long. But I put in there, I put in like chia seeds and hemp and ground flax
Nice.
um and some like almond milk usually or something like that. And sometimes I do honey in there, but I did that this morning and I was like, oh, this is actually pretty good. I was like, for fiber, but not really for uh, protein, I don't think. It definitely wasn't 30 to 40 grams of
Yeah,
protein. But there are times when I put protein powder in there too, which
exactly.
then it would hit like, but I ran out of protein powder. So,
I
but
mean, and that's actually a perfect example of like even when you have those solutions figured out for yourself, we all have ebbs and flows where we deviate a little bit off track.
mhm,
The protein powder runs out and you don't get to the store for a couple of weeks, right? And then boom, your
mhm,
protein levels take a hit,
yeah,
or it gets crazy and the eating pattern gets deviated. So having those meals like kind of tucked away either in Chronometer or written in a meal plan or a booklet of like these are my go-to meals, then it's really easy to get back to it even if you've had months away and
mhm.
you can't recall immediately what they were, right? You've got that resource.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's awesome. Um, so another like final question that I want to ask you is a lot of my listeners are very close to my age, which is middle aged. I'm 55. I'm not in menopause yet. I'm in perimenopause. So my body doesn't want to let go of,
Mhm.
you know, it's like holding on. I feel like I'm going to be in perimenopause forever. But anyway, what are some tips with all of your experience and your knowledge? What are some really basic tips for women in this stage of their life that would really keep them in a good state of health, like as they move into menopause?
I think the simplest and most effective thing is to always be thinking about your protein and your produce.
Okay.
If at the start of each meal you are looking, or you sit down to a restaurant, you open up the menu, ask yourself, okay, where's the protein? Where's the produce?
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes finding the produce is a little bit harder than finding the protein on a
Mm-hmm.
menu. But looking for those two things and making sure that they show up at each meal is, I believe, single-handedly the most important thing that we can do to age powerfully,
Mm-hmm.
because we need that protein for our musculature. And our musculature is like our first line of defense against developing diabetes, because muscle is a very enthusiastic consumer of glucose. And
Good point.
if you have muscle mass, you can metabolize glucose
Mm-hmm.
and you protect yourself from developing type 2 diabetes. Muscle mass is also correlated with reduced risk of osteoporosis. Those who have the most muscle have the least osteoporosis as they age, both men and women. And so muscle is extremely important. So lift the heavy things, look for the protein.
Let me ask you a question because I know people are going to be thinking this. As you said, it's not those little 3 pound weights, right?
Yeah.
And so everybody's different. Everybody has different uh, levels of strength, right? And so you can't tell someone lift this much. This is the right weight for you. So what is a good guideline for somebody when they're starting to lift weights? How much is enough that's really going to help you start building that muscle?
What you want to do is you want to lift a weight that you physically can't lift more than 10 or 12 times in a
So you come
single.
to like failure. You're feeling like you get to that
Exactly.
12th one and you're like, just can't get it all the way up.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. The arms are shaking, it's not,
Yeah.
you're not able to lift that arm all the way up. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I do also strongly encourage women to either find like a boutique fitness studio if they're not comfortable in a gym, or an at-home personal trainer for a couple of sessions to help them be comfortable with weightlifting, because
Hmm.
we came from an era where women lifting heavy things is just like, that's not, we didn't grow up with that.
No,
You know, that
no.
has changed, thankfully. The girls now in their 20s are looking to I think, what is the word for it? They say snatched, I believe. And
Yeah.
they're all about getting strong, which I
Hmm.
love. I'm so glad that we have finally transitioned past the you can't be too rich or too thin phase
Yeah. Yeah.
culture. So yeah, you want to lift something that you're feeling definite fatigue. You don't have to be so sore you can't move the next day. In fact, that's often counterproductive,
Hmm.
but you want something where it is a struggle to lift it more than 10 to 12 times.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the challenge is if you are doing this consistently, whatever that weight is that you start with, you will outgrow it, right? You'll be
Hmm.
too strong for that. In, maybe 4 to 6 weeks, you'll be
Yeah.
ready for something heavier. And one of the things that if you're lifting at home or you're working out at home, the adjustable weight sets, Bowflex is
Yes.
a popular one. I
Those are so,
love them.
I was just going to say that. That's what I have. My son actually gave it to me because he moved and he didn't want to take it with him. I was like, sure, I'll take that off your hands. Thank you.
They're
Like,
amazing.
yeah. And it's really great because you're probably not going to outgrow it. And I think another important point is that no matter, I really do believe that no matter what we do as a middle-aged woman, you're not going to get bulky. You're just
Right.
not,
Yep.
because it's sometimes I feel like it's like a losing struggle, like I'm building and I'm losing, and at least I'm holding on to like, the muscle I built. And I think I shared with you that I did CrossFit throughout my 40s with my kids.
Yeah.
And it was really like this family get together thing. And we really enjoyed it. And the people that we went with, we became friends with. It was like this whole community.
That's
And
awesome.
I'm so glad I did that, because if I didn't do that, I don't think I would have been lifting weights. And so I can't remember what you called it, but like I built up a lot of muscle,
Hmm.
and
Oh, yes. You filled your bank account, as it
that's,
were.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Your savings
yeah,
account for the
yeah.
future. Yeah.
So I'm glad I did that. And I just started lifting weights again. So
Excellent.
yeah, so
Super
I
important.
think it's
Yeah.
very, very important. So I think these are like, thank you so much for all of these tips. I think
Yeah.
they're
I
really,
would,
really important.
if possible, I would also like to kind of circle back around and talk a little bit about the produce and the importance of the produce piece.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's easy to miss the produce.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's in part because we're not trained to look for it. So again, that second question is, where is my produce? And look for vegetables, ideally, and fruit, and include those at every meal, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
blueberries at breakfast are fantastic. It's
Yeah.
perfect. And you really want to aim for that 5 servings a day as a minimum. Some research suggests that we continue to experience benefits of produce consumption all the way up to 10 servings a day.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to skimp on the produce, and our diet should be mostly unprocessed, low starch plant foods, our produce, and then supplemented with starches for energy and protein for that muscle. So it's all the antioxidants that we need to keep our cells healthy and to
Mm-hmm.
prevent aging and degeneration of the cell at the cellular level. All of those vitamins and minerals that we need as well to stay healthy. A lot of them are in those plant foods. So they're also excruciatingly important to
Mm-hmm.
get at each meal. And
Yeah.
actually, I would love to offer your listeners, because the produce piece is often very hard to find and to get
Mm-hmm.
because it is an unprocessed food and it spoils and it often requires some preparation. So I'd love to give all of the listeners my guide for 5 servings a day in 15 minutes or less.
Yes, that would be
So
great. That would be
so that they,
wonderful.
yeah, so they can make it a little bit easier to increase their produce intake.
Yeah. And something that I do, and I don't want people to overlook this, something I do to improve my chances of eating produce, especially if you're the type of person that always has like that bag in the back of your fridge that's just like green slime, and you're like, what? I don't know what that was. I meant well when I bought that, but I never opened it. Don't be afraid to buy frozen,
Yeah.
because You know, like the blueberry things, like having the blueberries in the house all the time. If I bought fresh blueberries all the time, first of all, you know, I'd have to get a second job.
Hmm.
And then they would constantly go bad, I think. I really do. Even though I eat a lot of them, they're always, you know, going bad. So I buy frozen blueberry. I buy frozen organic blueberries. I always have them. And the same goes, especially in the winter when I have a vegetable garden. So I know not everybody has the space for that. I mean, you can grow vegetables on your patio and your deck. And I would encourage people to do that because it's so much fun and it's so easy and it's so much cheaper. But you know, in the winter, I'm buying frozen broccoli, frozen cauliflower, frozen edamame. I'm just buying, you know, and it's always there, you know, frozen Brussels sprouts, you know, like just grab it. Sometimes like I just grab one of those. That's like a snack for me. I like roast them and then I coat them in like a tahini dressing or something like
Oh,
that.
yum.
Really good, like lemon tahini. But yeah, don't be afraid to do that. Like make things easy for yourself. My
Yeah,
God.
there's no harm in frozen food. There are a couple of vitamins, most notably vitamin C, which denatures a bit when frozen or exposed to heat.
Hmm.
However, most of our vegetables and fruits are picked and frozen on site. And
Hmm.
so they have a chance to stay on the plant until they're perfectly ripe. And this is why frozen fruit often tastes sweeter, is
Hmm.
because it's actually riper. It has more nutrients, it has more antioxidants, it has more phytochemicals in it. And they pick it and then they freeze it immediately so it doesn't go through the nutrient degradation that happens for something that's picked underripe, gassed, trucked across the country, sitting in a grocery store for weeks.
Yes.
In many instances, frozen food is actually more nutrient dense than fresh, depending on where you live and where you're purchasing your produce.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's frozen is fantastic.
Yeah, that's definitely saved me because, you know, sometimes I have really good intentions, you know, like I'll buy a head of cabbage or a head of, you know, cauliflower and I'm like, oh, I'll make that tomorrow night. Oh, I'll make that, you know, whatever, you know, and then it just sits there forever. And then one day
Yep.
it's just like you open your fridge and you're like, what's that? Like, especially cabbage and uh cauliflower.
The crucifers
So,
get quite aromatic as
oh
they age.
God, it's so awful. Anyway, how can people find you? Where do you hang out the most and where could they connect with you?
I am on Instagram at Vibrance Nutrition.
Hmm.
I am also on Facebook, although not as often.
Hmm.
And my website is vibrancenutrition.com. I
Okay,
also have a podcast called Blasphemous Nutrition.
cool.
And it is, I do share some naughty words on that podcast. However, the real reason it's blasphemous is because I live in this area of nuance
Hmm.
and nutrition is so polarized and so dogmatic. And I come from those roots, so I fully understand.
Hmm.
But because I now reside in this place where it's neither this nor that, and it all depends,
Hmm.
everything I say will
Hmm.
offend somebody. So
Yeah,
it's inherently blasphemous.
yeah, I love that. That's a great name. All right, it was great having you on. Thank you for all of your time and all of your great tips. I feel like we should do this again soon
I
because
would love to.
yeah, we have so much to talk about.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Thank you again for inviting me, Tina. I really appreciate it.